So good that you were able to make it. I think for us it was important to bring you together to give some perspective on the whole subject which currently is being discussed. I think also today at Coreper, the new CO2 standards for trucks. I mean, for us, there's no doubt that climate change is a major challenge that we need to address. I mean, CO2 emissions from trucks, buses, coaches represent approximately 6% of the total CO2 emissions in the European Union, and about 25% of total road transport CO2 emissions. So, but all sectors of our economy have to play their part in further reducing CO2 emissions, and we want to take up also our responsibility, so also truck manufacturers. We are at an important crossroads today because there's a lot happening right now. Early this week, the COP24 Climate Change Conference kicked off in Poland with the aim of refining the details of the 2015 Paris Agreement. And just last week, the European Commission adopted its long-term strategic vision called A Clean Planet for All, setting out the steps required for climate-neutral Europe by 2050. The vision of the Commission emphasizes that the EU should innovate and invest in realistic technological solutions and should align key areas such as industrial policy and research in order to reach net zero emissions by 2050. But while these initiatives focus on long-term goals for the next 3 decades, at the EU level, we are currently also dealing with the short-term proposals on CO2 targets for trucks that have been proposed for the years 2025 and 2030. As ACEA, representing the European Union's 7 major truck producers, we think it's important to share our views on where we stand today with regard to these proposals, which, as I said, also going to be discussed today at Coreper level. Let me reiterate that it's an important proposal for us. We consider it as very important. Our industry is ready to further drive down CO2 reductions from trucks. But at the same time, we call obviously on policymakers to strike the right balance between environmental objectives and the sector's competitiveness when finalizing this regulation. So that as general perspective, and with that I want to hand over to the chairman of ACEA's Commercial Vehicle Board, Joachim Drees.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eric. Good morning, everybody. It's good that we can sit here and discuss probably about the regulation which is upcoming and what is our view as ACEA regarding this matter. I think it's important to note that only in May the first ever CO2 standards for trucks have been proposed in 2025 and 2030 effective by the European Commission. And I think this overall legislative process has been going at an unprecedented speed for a very complex and technical discussion, as obviously trucks are different from passenger cars. Also, just a few weeks ago, the European Parliament voted on this file last month, and the Council is currently negotiating a common position under the presidency of Austria. In fact, the committee of the permanent representatives is meeting today, as Eric just mentioned, on this matter, and we hope this will seriously consider the particularities of our heavy-duty vehicle industry before reaching an agreement. And this has been basically the work we have been doing as ACEA all the time, trying just to educate, I think, everybody around what is a commercial vehicle versus a other regulated areas such as passenger cars. Of course, there's lots of discussion on national level, but we are concerned that there is a general misperception that the industry is in opposition to the introduction of these CO2 emission standards for our sectors. I mean, let's just be absolutely clear here. We are not fighting against the regulation. We are committed to go on reducing CO2 emissions. What we are fighting for is a well-balanced regulation. I think also you point this out, and I think one point Eric just made is that also in the long-term strategy it is around technologically meaningful and realistic matters to be done. I think one of that enables and supports our industry to deliver the necessary CO2 reductions without losing sight of our customer needs. And of course, we are a customer-driven industry. Our customers need to make money with trucks. They're not lifestyle products, so they need to make money. And we cannot lose sight of the competitiveness of our industry. If you think of the ambition level which has been proposed by the European Commission, with minus 15% in 2025 and minus 30% in 2030, this of course sets a path towards reaching the Paris Climate Agreement targets. However, I think these targets are extremely ambitious. Some may, and I think this is a discussion, maybe even over-ambitious, as we don't have yet a technical path to achieve these targets. So reaching these targets will not be achievable with existing technologies alone. We have to deliver new technologies which are not yet clear which they could be in order to achieve this. I think it will require the rapid and large-scale deployment of new powertrain technologies, many of which are not, as I just said, readily available for market introduction across all vehicle segments, namely long-haul, regional, and urban delivery. It's also to be considered that the development cycles, of course, in the heavy-duty industry are much longer than you know it from other industries or from the passenger car industry in particular. So I think this is something which needs to be kept in mind when discussing these targets. However, while using electric power for a delivery truck operating in urban environments can make sense, a scenario where electrical power, for example, is the right choice for a 14-ton truck operating between, say, Spain and Poland is much less likely in the midterm or even in the long term. You just have to consider how much weight has to be carried and how this whole thing has to be set up. This means, from our point of view, to meet the CO2 targets is an extremely high proportion of medium-sized urban and regional delivery vehicles will have already to be zero emission in a few years. And whatever the vehicle segment is, a stronger market uptake of alternatively powered trucks requires some basic prerequisites to be in place, many of which are outside of the control of our industry, which I consider a very important point. There's many elements which we cannot actually influence. And in this context, I'm thinking, for instance, of adequate investment in charging and refueling infrastructure, as well as a rapid fleet renewal by transport operators as such. This is not a small task. When it comes to electric trucks, the required recharging infrastructure is not the same as that used for electric cars. Indeed, if an electric heavy-duty truck was to use electric car infrastructure, it could take days to recharge it. So the issue is that the required recharging infrastructure suitable for trucks is simply not available today. To replace diesel, which is a clean way of driving our trucks, in the long run, in the long-haul segment, electricity needs to be available in sufficient quantities along all major routes in Europe at all times. Even more, the spaces alongside motorways for trucks to park while recharging is also lacking. Indeed, as many transport operators know, there are already insufficient parking spaces available to meet the requirements of the Working Time Directive. And you just need to go out in the evenings on the motorway and you see this overfilled parking spots, and now you have to consider also this in connection with a recharging infrastructure. In urban logistics, fleet owners have to take care for the charging facilities on their premises by themselves, including its financing, which of course puts further cost pressure on these operators. And as you may know, these companies are not heavily profitable. The average profitability is around 1 to say 2.5% return on sales for these businesses. However, we support the European Commission's idea of introducing specific incentives to stimulate innovation and the uptake of alternatively powered trucks. In this respect, we welcome the introduction of a super credit system as proposed to encourage the widest possible deployment of low and zero emission vehicles wherever it makes sense. However, we are also highly concerned with discussions about an alternative benchmark system that includes a malus, so a negative, basically incentive, which would penalize manufacturers who do not sell a mandatory quota of zero or and low emission trucks. With all the obstacles zero emission vehicles face, no infrastructure available, loss of payload, loss of range, and higher cost, what happens if our customers don't choose to buy these trucks? Because again, they need to make money with our vehicles. It's not a lifestyle product. Policymakers need to be aware that forcing manufacturers to provide a certain supply of zero emission vehicles when there is an insufficient demand would be extremely risky and of course unacceptable for our industry. Another big concern we have is that on top of the ambition levels have been set very high now, well beyond what we can actually picture ourselves right now. And the proposals on the table include massive penalties for manufacturers who are unable to reach the targets. I would like to make it clear that we are not against the principle of penalties in case of excess CO2 emissions. However, we are concerned about the disproportionate amount being proposed. Based on these amounts, a truck manufacturer that exceeds its target by just 1 gram CO2 per ton kilometer would have to pay hundreds of millions of euros of penalties. And you always have to put this in light and in relation to the size of the truck companies, which are of course smaller compared to other industry players such as the passenger car business. So we believe this would seriously jeopardize our sector's competitiveness or even the survival of some of the competitors in the market. If you look at the interim review, we agree with the need for an interim review of the indicative 2030 target in 2022. This is as proposed by the Commission. However, based on this review, it should be possible to adjust the 2030 target upwards or downwards in order to reflect the realities of the heavy-duty vehicle market at the point of time, driven by factual data that will be collected by the data. Please keep in mind, the baseline on which this all is based is not available today. The baseline will be available sometime in the last quarter of 2020, most likely, or fourth quarter of 2020, and we don't know on which baseline we're actually basing this. So that makes it even more problematic. So this review should, for example, take into account the availability of refueling and charging infrastructure for alternatively powered trucks, as well as the market uptake of such vehicles, which are all unknown at this point. Likewise, we believe that any CO2 target must be reviewed in light of potential new Euro standards, because we are about to introduce Euro 6D. There is now the discussion around Euro 6E, and then of course there will be a further consideration at some point in time of Euro 7 most likely. And all these standards go against CO2 reduction because you need more fuel in order to get the system working in a way so that the pollutants are reduced. So ladies and gentlemen, there is no doubt that climate change is a fundamental challenge requiring efforts to cut CO2 emissions from all sectors. I think Eric also very well pointed this out in his opening remarks. The EU truck industry is fully committed to contribute its part. And in this context, we are calling on all national governments to adopt a well-balanced and viable approach, as they've actually in their long-term vision said themselves, to the new CO2 truck standards. This essentially means making sure that the right framework conditions are in place to encourage a widespread deployment of zero and low emission trucks, and in terms of infrastructure, incentives, and fleet renewal. This will be a prerequisite to deliver an ambitious target. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Mr. Drees. It's now time for a Q&A session. I would first of all like to explain our house rules. Mr. Drees is speaking in his capacity as chairman of the ACEA Commercial Vehicles Board, so we will not deal with company-specific questions. And before asking a question, could you please clearly state your name and the media outlet you're working for? Please.
I'm Claude Evans from Truck and Business magazine. You said that there is no technological path ready for for adoption, for ready adoption. At the same time, we have a Korean truck manufacturer, Hyundai, who is starting to sell fuel cell trucks in Switzerland from next year onwards. At the same time, next year we'll have a new American truck manufacturer who will be presenting a European-ready hydrogen truck using Bosch technology.
Mhm.
Has the European industry been sleeping, or am I seeing things from a totally wrong perspective?
Certainly, the European industry hasn't been sleeping. I mean, the most fuel-efficient engines right now and the most fuel-efficient trucks are actually built in by the European manufacturers. I think this is a clear sign that that we have not been sleeping as an industry. I always look at this. These are test fields. Yes, I mean we are all testing a lot. I mean you can read about each company which is member of ACEA. That we have also tested electric trucks, we have tested hydrogen trucks, we have tested gas trucks. So I think this is a big difference between testing something for a certain application in a certain segment, rather than saying, okay, I have to produce hundreds of thousands of these vehicles ready to use. So no, I don't think that the European industry has been sleepy at all. Actually, we're on the forefront of the technological development here.
Hyundai will be selling trucks next year.
Yeah, they will be leasing trucks. Yeah, it's a big difference. Yeah. I think it's a very interesting initiative they have picked up there, and we'll find out how many trucks there will be in the market then. Yeah.
Just to build upon what Mr. Drees said, I mean, clearly, even if one sees some of these developments, I mean, even for the case in point you mentioned, the jury is still out there whether the infrastructure will be there to fuel those type of vehicles. Yeah? We know, especially when you talk about fuel cell vehicles, I mean, the infrastructure is one of the, I mean, for electric it's already a big one, but for fuel cell vehicles it's even some. So that's why we are at the same time, as we are engaging in the discussions with Commission, Parliament, Council now on CO2 for trucks, we try to engage at the same time on the subject of infrastructure, making sure that there is investments made, because that will be needed in order to make the wider expansion of this alternative powertrains a success in the market in Europe. And I know there's a lot of talk about that, but we haven't seen in practice a lot yet happening. And of course the discussion so far was focused on passenger cars, and now we see also member states looking at recharging points for passenger cars big time, yeah? Which is good, we applaud that. But as we already said, recharging infrastructure for trucks is a different thing, and especially alongside highways. And so there we really think it's important to have in parallel these discussions, because they are needed.
Maybe one further comment, particularly to your question, because of course, because I know that the European commercial vehicle manufacturers are on the forefront of the technological change. If you think of hydrogen and if you think of fuel cell, I spent actually almost 4 years very closely to fuel cells in the late 90s and in the early 2000s, so I spent a lot of time there. If you want to have a well-to-wheel approach, yeah, and if you think of hydrogen, today hydrogen is mostly available as a byproduct of other industrial processes. Of course, for this it's quite efficient to use hydrogen. But if you have to produce hydrogen in an industrial scale usage, the big question is where do you produce it? And if you want to produce it from electrolysis, you have to do it somewhere where you have a lot of sun. Then you have the inefficiency between basically from power to hydrogen and from hydrogen to power. This is today, if you look at the whole thing, it's not necessarily the most efficient way to power something.
So any other questions?
Yeah, Philip Blanken, sort of Reuters. Can I just check the ACEA targets? Well, sorry, the proposed targets are 2025 7 and 2030 16. Is that right?
That's
Yep.
what.
In terms of cars, it would appear that and obviously there's a discussion. It's further along the chain. It's in the trilogue. It seems to be kind of potentially a bit more flexibility on the 2030 and a bit less on the 2025. Is that how you might see the situation for trucks?
Clearly, I mean, for us, I think I pointed out in the beginning of my press conference, the development cycles in trucks are much longer than you see them. I mean, normally you can see a new truck every 15 to 20 years. That shows us, of course, that that's why we also said as ACEA in 2030 we can consider higher reductions, the 16% which we originally proposed, than what we can do in the short term. In particular, as I also mentioned, if there's no baseline available. We have no baseline today. So the baseline, we need to look at the baseline, and then we need to see the technologies. We have to look at the development cycles, and then we can look at more ambitious targets. But of course, they have to be sensible still.
I think that is making the discussion so different from other discussions we have in town on CO2 standards, of course, is this baseline. We talk about ambition level minus X% versus 2019, but the data of 2019, they are not known yet. So yes, there are some assumptions which one can make, but they are not real facts yet. And so there is this uncertainty as well on what actually in absolute values this would look like. So again, for 25, we need to be, in that respect, a bit more realistic than for 2030, where of course then things have advanced.
So I think we have time for one or two more short questions.
Just to be sure, did I understand that correctly, that you're proposing 16% for 2030? Because I mean, you spoke at length about, and by by the way, what is not possible, but not really concretely what is possible from your point of view.
No, I think we are very clear here. I mean, I guess again important is the commercial vehicle industry has always driven down CO2, and we have been doing this over the last 30 years, and we can prove this. Because it is in our customers' interest to have less CO2 because it means less cost for a not very profitable business. Second, that's the first point, which I think always gets lost a little bit in the discussion. I always say if one of the manufacturers would have the silver bullet to reduce CO2, we would have developed this, back to your point, because that would actually drive market share to the respective company who would have this technology. Coming back to what ACEA has proposed, we said 7% in 2025 and 16% reduction in 2030. Also with the initiative to review the targets in 2022, which could be, in our case, maybe upward or downward, but maybe it's more space going up. But when you go to 30%, and if you go even to the European Parliament's proposal, which is go even beyond that, this is highly problematic, and quite honestly, nobody really knows how to get there.
So a final question from Frédéric?
Yes, Eric Simon from Euractiv. You seem to be placing a lot more emphasis on infrastructure deployment, it seems to me, than in the past, so more accepting that electrification will happen. So I was wondering what the industry has actually done in order to encourage infrastructure deployment. I suppose you don't expect the public authorities, whether at European or the national level, to do everything. So what initiatives have you taken? Do you have any practical suggestions?
I can answer.
Yeah, if you want.
I mean, I think each of the producers here or manufacturers of commercial trucks, we have set up, I think, several things. We of course do a lot of work with infrastructure providers that we better understand how this could look like. Then secondly, we also actually support our customers, particularly when it comes to the bus customers, and also for the more local or city delivery, how to actually deploy an infrastructure, how to get actually charging in place based on what we have as a grid today. So we have actually invested in people who are consulting our customers how they have to set up such a structure at all. And I think it cannot be really us who have to invest in each of the charging points, but it's supposed to be us who helps them to understand what it looks like, what it is needed, and how we can do it best. And there we are actually supporting, and this is very well received by for example, public transport companies. They appreciate this piece of advice very much, which our industry is giving to those customers. And of course, we are working, as I said, with people who are producing these charging stations in order to make them technologically available. Of course, there is really not many electric trucks so far. We're in the very beginning of this, and this is actually coming back to what we're always saying. This is always on the beginning, and if you think of actually long haul, it's very problematic, as I said earlier, to think of a battery-driven vehicle. You need to recharge so often, otherwise you have too much weight on the truck. I mean, we always say there could be applications in the city where it makes more sense, such as the bus or such as local distribution, and we support this with our technological knowledge on that side.
And on top, I just want to clarify that, of course, on the infrastructure side, we know that the Commission came up with a plan in that respect and called upon member states to have investment plans ready when it comes to recharging infrastructure. Given that came at the time there were the discussion on CO2 standards for passenger cars, the risk we face is that all these investments that member states are making on the infrastructure side is narrowly focusing passenger cars only. And you see that in the narrative already when you engage on recharging with a lot of authorities. It's passenger cars, and they don't or have the tendency to overlook trucks. And there, especially if we want to go for long haul, it will have to be done alongside highways. And that's still something where there are opportunities. But clearly a lot of private players are looking into that, and okay, we are engaging with as many as possible, but especially we want to use this as an opportunity, especially to call upon the member states to take this as serious for trucks as for passenger cars.
Do you have maybe a date in mind for like a demonstration project where one or several highways would be electrified with recharging points?
That you should ask to the governments, I think, rather than to us, right?
When we ask them as well, there is no
clear commitment yet.
There's no commitment.